Welcome to School of the Civil War Soldier #1, Infantry Tactics of the American Civil War. I'm Nick Noppinger, and hopefully this will be the first of many videos, and we'll see how it goes. And this is my first video that I'm going to be uploading, and we'll see how this goes. A couple of questions I get about the Civil War. And for those that don't know, I'm a military historian, particularly of this period, but I cover periods from ancient all the way up to the modern times. But a couple of questions I do get is about the Civil War, particularly about how Civil War battles were fought. Was standing in line shoulder to shoulder the best means of fighting? Other questions, did the rifle musket make these tactics obsolete? And the rifle musket basically being they're rifling inside the grooves of the musket. We'll take a look at what those muskets look like pretty shortly. And then, was the Civil War bloodier than past wars because of the adoption of rifled weapons? In reality, it's a myth. The rifle musket completely revolutionized firepower, particularly lethality over distance. That really is a myth, at least as far as the practice of the American Civil War. The military on both sides continued to use outmoded tactics that led to much higher casualties. And we're going to see that that was not particularly true. It's being taught today, unfortunately, even by some other mainstream historians, and we'll figure out and look into some of the reasons why some of these historians continue to teach these myths about the war. The Civil War, again, this is another myth, was much bloodier than previous conflicts because of the rifled weapons. Rifled muskets allowed musket fire for ranges up to 600 yards, in some cases even beyond, depending on the musket. The Civil War made the tactical offensive obsolete. These are, again, some of the myths that get perpetuated about this. In reality, the rifled musket was only marginally more effective on the battlefield than the smoothbore musket. It was the adoption of breech-loading repeaters that made the linear formation obsolete. And I would even venture to argue that it was the adoption of what we call the Maxim machine gun, the machine gun developed by Hiram Maxim and not the famed Gatling gun. The Maxim gun is kind of what you see as most machine guns today that would make these linear tactics that had basically been in warfare for the last few hundred years obsolete. The militaries of both sides used the 1858, and again, this is going to be changed, particularly for the Union side. They're going to update this, and both sides will update this to a certain degree. The 1858 manual, which loosened up the linear formation, which also increased the use of skirmishers. The Army was well aware as early as 1853 of the potential of the rifle musket. Then U.S. Secretary of War Jefferson Davis authorized a detailed study to modernize the U.S. Army. Whether say what you will about Jefferson Davis as president of the Confederacy, he was actually a fairly good, forward-thinking Secretary of War for the United States. And we'll go into a little bit more detail about that. The Napoleonic Wars were every bit as bloody and perhaps bloodier using smoothbore weapons. The Mexican War casualty rate was proportional to the Civil War, as we're going to see. There are a few examples of sustained effective musketry fights during the Civil War greater than 300 yards, which itself was rare and only done by specialized troops. Most Civil War firefights took place at 140 yards, 150 yards or less, as we're going to see. And that's true of most wars. Most wars, infantry firefights take place in much less than the capability of the weapons. And that's generally, when we'll go into some of the details, but terrain and when you're fighting in built-up areas, that tends to lessen the average distance. So before we start talking about infantry tactics, when we start using words like Army, Corps, Division, Brigade, Regiment, Company, as we're going to see, what exactly does that mean in the Civil War? Well, a regiment was made up of 10 companies, and each company at full strength would be about 100 men at full strength. Now, rarely did they meet that, or were they at that level of number of soldiers during the war. And it's because most of the soldiers are going to die of disease. And even with, if that wasn't the issue, you would have some soldiers on detached duties. So most companies during the war, at least when they got into the battle, put somewhere between 40, 60, 80 men would be a very good sized company, but 40 to 60 would be a good average. So there's 10 companies to a regiment. There is something called the battalion that exists between companies and regiments, and that was formations that didn't meet the level of regiment. So a regiment would be 10 companies. A battalion would be a formation that would be, when it's formed, it has less than 10 companies. In some cases, some of the battalions and regiments, as you're going to see, there's a few battalions when you look at the order of battle at the Battle of Gettysburg, one being the 2nd Maryland Battalion, were actually the size of regiments with the number of soldiers there, as far as total number of soldiers, even if they didn't have all 10 companies. In a regiment, you would have somewhere between, on low end, a couple of hundred soldiers, high end, 600, 700 soldiers. Normally, again, 10 companies, you know, if they were at full strength, you'd be looking at 1,000. Rarely were Civil War regiments anywhere close to that when they were on the battlefield. A brigade would be 2 or more regiments. A division would be 2 or more brigades. A corps would be 2 or more divisions. Generally, 3 would be a good number. Occasionally, you'll see 4, and occasionally you'll see 5. And then an army, like say in the case of the Battle of Gettysburg, the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia, would be multiple numbers of corps. In the Army of Northern Virginia, it was 3 corps, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd under Longstreet, Richard Ewell, and A.P. Hill, and a cavalry division under Jeb Stuart. In the Army of the Potomac, they had 7 corps and a cavalry corps, plus an artillery reserve. So just give you an idea of what that meant. But let's take a look at what Civil War muskets, particularly the weapons used at the Battle of Gettysburg. The 2 primary muskets that were at the and equipped troops at the Battle of Gettysburg were the Springfield Model 1861 and the Enfield Model 1853. Those are the top 2 on this video here. And the Springfield was a .58 caliber, where the Enfield was .577. Both sides used both, even though the Enfields tend to predominate in the Confederate Army. But the Union Army also was equipped with the Enfield, or at least some of their units. Some other weapons that were at Gettysburg were the Mississippi Rifle of 1841, the Richmond Percussion Rifle Musket, which was a Confederate copy of the Springfield. Largely from equipment that they had taken from Harper's Ferry. Another principal firearm that you'll see a lot at the Battle of Gettysburg was the Austrian 1854 Large rifle musket. And that's a rifle that had both its detractors and people that did enjoy that weapon. Now, the big difference between the Civil War and the wars that came before it was the introduction of something called the percussion cap. When you go back to the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, they're using the flintlock system. Now, the percussion cap, if you take a look, it's basically, if any of you had the old cap guns in the day, it's a little piece of metal with fulminate of mercury in it, and that would be the ignition. And the cartridges would be paper with gunpowder in it. And then you would have either the round ball or bucking ball or something called the mini ball, which we're going to see shortly. And that's how and we'll go through, and I have a good video from Gettysburg that goes into detail as to how these guns were loaded. In addition, one of the main breech loading weapons, where most of the rifle muskets are muzzle loaded, and what a muzzle load means is they're loading it at the end of the barrel. A breech loader is they're loading it. If you take a look where the cursor's located here, they're loading it at the breech or in through the stock in some of the weapons of the American Civil War. Obviously, a muzzle loader takes much longer to load. A Sharps or breech loader, or the Spencer, which would be the Spencer breech loading repeater, are much easier to load and fire in combat. So they're going to have a faster rate of fire for those weapons. But the vast majority of troops are going to be equipped with the musket. Again, this is just showing you the difference. This would be a mini ball cartridge. Now, again, the cartridge would come in that paper, and they would tear that paper, pour the powder in, and then again, we'll go into some of the loading. And this is showing the the 58 mini ball, the 69th with a wooden plug, the 69 ball for if you had the smoothbore muskets, and still there were some units that still kept the smoothbore, and the 69 bucking ball, which is basically the round ball with a couple of smaller shots in there. And this is showing you the Civil War mini bullet, not the whole cartridge, just the mini ball, compared with a modern round and what that looks like today. So let's take a look at this video. And this is an old video from Gettysburg National Military Park.
Loading and firing the musket is probably the most important lesson the soldier can learn. New recruits are taught the loading procedure in 9 counts. Prepare to load. Load. Handle cartridge. Tear cartridge. Charge cartridge. Draw rammer. Ram cartridge. Return rammer. Prime. Shoulder arms. Ready? Aim. Fire. Having the sequence well drilled into the soldier means fewer mistakes and more firepower on the line. A veteran soldier can load and fire 3 aimed shots per minute. A single soldier is like a single bee or ant. They only become really effective in groups. They stand and support each other.
Shoulder, fire. Firing by file. Commence, fire.
Companies can give fire in a number of ways. For a constant, sustained fire, they fire by file. The company also has a 1-2 punch that kicks like a mule.
Company will fire by rank. Rear rank. Ready. Aim. Fire. Load. Front rank. Ready. Aim. Fire. Load. The company will fire by music. Commence. Fire.
Generally, when coming into engagements, they fire a volley for effect, and then the men fire at will to get the most lead possible into the air. A regiment of about 400 men can fire more than 1,200 rounds per minute and sustain that until their ammunition is gone.
In reality, sustaining 3 rounds a minute was pretty difficult for them to do that over the long term. And when we look at Civil War combats, when these regiments went into combat, it tended to be fairly short that they were in there, but also fairly bloody when they were in there, depending on where they were at. So this is what, in a diagram form, what those linear tactics you saw of a regiment in linear formation. And again, this is a textbook, not always the case. And one of the things you'll notice at the bottom of this is the skirmish line, and that would be several hundred yards or even a few hundred yards in front of the regiment. And basically they would be generally about 6 feet apart, where the guys here in the ranks would be shoulder to shoulder. And notice they also have a couple of companies in reserve here in case something happens that they can deal with some type of contingency. But why was the rifle musket evolutionary and not revolutionary. I mean, you would figure that with a rifle musket, this would make these weapons considerably more accurate. What caused that to be the case? But let's take a look at, before that, what the military science, what the militaries, not just the American military, but what other armies were thinking, because they were all adopting this new rifle musket system at about the same time. So all European armies and the American armies were aware that the rifle musket mini system could potentially, potential's the big word here, change military tactics. A Prussian Captain Wittig and a Belgian Captain Willem were the first in 1849 to write that the new weapon could have significant effects on battlefield tactics. So 1849 is 11 years before the American Civil War. In 1854, the British create the School of Musketry at Hythe. All British units, meaning their regiments, are to pass through the school on rotation. And usually it was a 5 or 6 year rotation. So every regiment would pass through this School of Musketry at Hythe within every 5 to 6 years. That was the ideal. That, and again, ideal is not always reality. So, but this will lead to, if anybody's familiar with particularly World War I British musketry, the Mad Minute drill will come out of this Hythe system. The French chose a little bit different, and the Americans were going to adopt something along the lines of the French. They chose to speed up the movements of the infantry and eliminate the differences between the light and line infantry that existed before that. So basically, light and line troops would be exactly the same. In the French army, the light troops would fight mostly in skirmish mode. And interestingly enough, not all of them were equipped with rifles. Some of them were still equipped with smoothbore weapons. But the French choose to speed up the movement of how quickly the men go from position to position. These are some pictures of the high school for the British Army. And they were the ones that really adopted, the first to adopt advanced marksmanship training. And they did that before our American Civil War. Excuse me. In U.S. military science in 1855, Secretary Ward Jefferson Davis adopted the MINIE system and ordered the U.S. Army to start marksmanship training. The problem is they don't. The United States Army does not have an army-wide marksmanship program until well after the American Civil War. Doesn't happen during the Civil War. And we're going to explain what that means specifically for Civil War armies shortly, but they don't have an army-wide program where they taught soldiers marksmanship. Those soldiers are going to get taught those 9 counts that you just saw, but they're not going to be taught the average soldier. He's not going to be given enough bullets to shoot to become proficient as a marksman. So what the Army does do, and the reason they don't do that is lack of money. They will send officers overseas to observe the developments in Europe. One of the officers, a guy by the name of George Brent McClellan. They will adopt one of the books that they adopt is William J. Hardy, who will become a Civil War lieutenant general in the Confederate Army, right in light rifle and light infantry tactics, 1855. And Hardy, adopting from the French, increased the speed in which the infantry moved in the face of the enemy, increasing the speed of double step and quick step. So they're looking at this as saying, and the reason they're increasing the speed is to decrease the amount of time that they're under marksman or under fire from the other side's rifle muskets. In the Army, they called it the Shanghai drill. Another Civil War officer who will become a general in the Confederate Army, Cadmus Wilcox, will do rifle and rifle practice, the first practical instructions for judging distances. And that's going to be another weakness for most soldiers. So the U.S. military increases the speed of movement, and this is prior to the war. And this is what the two armies, both the United States Army and the Confederate States Army, are going to take into their military training. They'll increase the speed of movement, increase the importance of skirmishing, but they could not agree whether this new rifle musket would drastically change it. They were thinking that it could have some effect, but they didn't exactly know what that was going to be. They did, in all cases, pretty much every officer talking about this called for an American School of Musketry based on the British model with advanced marksmanship training. So we tend to look at these past officers like they were stupid and that they continue to use these dumb, outmoded tactics that just got their soldiers killed. And in reality, that's not the case. So we do look at one of these questions that comes out of this as a corollary question: was the Civil War bloodier than past wars because of the adoption of rifled weapons? And the answer is a qualified no. Potentially, and I'm going to say this, potentially the rifled musket could have and should have changed battlefield tactics, but it didn't. And we're going to go to a few reasons why shortly. But in any case, the American Civil War, contrary to what you see sometimes on places like the History Channel or even some Civil War histories that go about it and that are not written by people that are not military historians, they want to say that the Civil War was bloodier than past wars. The answer is no, it wasn't. So let's take a look at comparison to casualties. This is the Napoleonic War. This is another extremely large war that was fought, largely between the 1790s and ended in 1815 with the Battle of Waterloo. Battle of Wagram, 330,000 men. This is a two-day battle. 80,000 casualties, or 24% total. Battle of Borodino. This is a one-day battle. 250,000 men, 90,000 casualties total, 36% casualty rate. Battle of Waterloo, another one-day battle. 190,000 men, 57,000 casualties, 30%. Battle of Austerlitz, a one-day battle. 133,000 total, 43,000 casualties, or 32%. So let's take a look at some of the Civil War battles. Battle of Gettysburg, 165,000 men, about 50 to some cases 53,000 casualties, 30%. See, it's right in line with what we're seeing here in the Napoleonic Wars. Battle of Antietam, which was our bloodiest day, had 132,000 men, 23,000 casualties. It's a one-day battle, 17%. Battle of Second Manassas, 112,000, 19,000 casualties, also another 17%. And I don't want people to read more into what I'm saying. The American Civil War is like all wars, is very bloody, but it's not outside the norm of what we're seeing in wars that immediately preceded the American Civil War. Battle of Chickamauga, 130,000, 36,000 casualties, or 28%. So let's take a look at some of the past American wars. The American Revolution has about a 15 to 20% casualty rate in the battles. The War of 1812 is about the same. Mexican War, 17%. There are other factors, but it's clear the Civil War was not substantially more lethal than previous wars. Now, most people say there's a big difference between 17 or 15 and 30%, and there is. That's doubling the casualties, but most of the Civil War battles don't reach that 30% mark. You look at the Napoleonic battles, and they were extremely deadly. So what causes the rifle musket during the American Civil War to be less effective than it should have been? There's a number of reasons. Terrain. How many of you have been to a Civil War battlefield? They're not flat. This isn't like Kansas. If you go to Gettysburg or Antietam, it's rolling, undulating hills, lots of contour in the ground. And the officers were taught how to use that terrain to minimize the time that their men would be under fire. So terrain significantly reduces the size of the tactical battlefield. And what I mean by the tactical battlefield is where the two units are blasting at each other. Because there are times that you're going to be under cover. You're not going to be seen. And simply because of terrain. The biggest reason is a lack of training. The U.S. Army, because of lack of funds, only adopted musketry, as we said earlier, after the Civil War. Most soldiers on both sides were not trained to fire accurately. They were trained to drill. Most soldiers were also not trained to judge distances. There are going to be exceptions to this. There are sharpshooter units. They tended to be trained, particularly Berdan sharpshooters. And in the Army Northern Virginia, they spent a lot of time on marksmanship compared to others. But it really depended upon the regimental commander. Some regimental commanders neglected it. Others were a little bit more proficient with it. But there was always a limit as to how much ammunition they were going to be given to train, with the exception of some of these specialized units. So what else? We're going to see something called the parabolic arc of a mini ball. The other part is heavy smoke from powder is going to reduce visibility. You saw a little bit where those guys were firing and you saw some of the smoke coming out of that musket, and it briefly obscured the man a little bit. Can you imagine hundreds or thousands of these guys firing all at once plus artillery? You might not be able to see even if the ground was flat. Fear. Men can be Annie Oakley on the practice field, but can freeze in battle, as we're going to see, courtesy of Hollywood. Even today, troops do not use weapons up to their potential. And I'm saying when the circumstances warrant it and terrain warrants it and factors warrant it, they do. But when you add fighting in built-up areas in mountainous terrain where the terrain obscures your ability to see the other side, this lowers the average distance of firefights, of military firefights. Even today, they take place much less than what the weapons today are capable of. And again, something else that comes out of this, if you look at the Army of the Potomac and look at their weapons returns for the Battle of Gettysburg, 1/3 of the Army of the Potomac was at least still partially equipped with smoothbore weapons. So it's not really till 1863 that the muskets really start replacing smoothbore muskets in each side. And the Eastern armies tended to be better equipped as a rule of thumb. Western armies tended to be less well so. But even still, there are Confederate units and Union units at Gettysburg still at least partially equipped with smoothbore weapons, in some cases by choice. Under 75 yards, there's no appreciable difference in accuracy between a smoothbore and a rifle musket. And some soldiers preferred the smoothbore at close in range because they like to use that buck and ball that we saw a little bit earlier as a particularly deadly weapon at close range, giving it a little bit of that shotgun effect. And the average Civil War firefight was only a little more than 20 yards greater than previous wars. And we looked at, again, we looked at all of the battles, meaning military historians looked at all of the battles and where they were firing at each other. And again, this is because the officers were trained to use terrain as concealment when applicable. The heavy smoke and confusion of the battlefield often made it difficult to see objects at a great distance, even on flat ground. We were just talking about that. And tactical offenses succeeded in the American Civil War when properly executed. When you look at Longstreet's attack on July 2nd, that was a really effective attack. In fact, from what we can tell, Longstreet's attacking troops inflicted more casualties on the Union forces they faced, meaning the divisions of Hood and McLaws and Longstreet's corps, than they took themselves, and they were the attacker. Longstreet's attack at Chickamauga and Longstreet's attack at Second Manassas were tactical offensives that succeeded. Jackson's attack at Chancellorsville was a tactical offensive. The failure rate of tactical offensives was about equal to what you saw in the Napoleonic Wars. So in reality, what we see is the rifle musket only marginally increased firepower in the battlefield because of its limited firepower. Linear tactics were still needed for command and control. One soldier is not really effective. As he said, it's like he's like a bee. He doesn't really become effective until he's got the entire group with him firing and putting a lot of lead into the air. So again, this is just kind of filling what we were talking about a little bit ago, but on average, a soldier would have to fire 84 at best, 250 at worst times before you hit another soldier. Soldiers usually carried 60 rounds or 40 rounds into battle, somewhere between 40 and 60. But let's take a look at, and again, I don't give Hollywood a lot of credit, but I'm going to give some credit here to the movie Glory, and we're using this again, taking it as a fair use of this and critique of the movie. But let's take a look at this clip from Glory.
One down, Kenzie.
Down on each other. Go on, boy. Go ahead, boy. Go ahead, Sean.
Attention, company! As you were. Right in the center. You're a good shot, Private. Thank you, sir. Squirrel hunting. Ever killed a man?
No, sir.
Well, you're handy with a gun.
Yes, sir.
Reload. Faster. Faster. Faster! Discharge your weapon. Discharge your weapon. Do it! Now do it again, only this time I want it done quickly. A good man can fire 3 aim shots in a minute. Major Forbes, give me a Colt revolver. Gun. Give it to me. Faster. Reload. Quickly. Faster. Faster. Load. Faster. Do it. Do it. Do it. Do it. Teach them properly, Major.
And what you're seeing here is when someone's firing at a range, they may be the greatest shot in the world. As I said, they could be Annie Oakley at the gun range, but when it comes to firing in a combat situation under pressure where people are trying to kill you, and we sometimes make light of that, or a lot of historians gloss over that fact. And the problem is the man started to fall apart. He couldn't perform under pressure. And that wasn't that unusual for guys new to combat or soldiers that, hadn't experienced that before. And it was showing you how unrealistic the marksmanship training that they were just doing in the range. And that does have its place. But the training methods, in order for them to work properly, need to be done under higher pressure in order for them to be effective. We have records from the U.S. Army Ordnance of several muskets being loaded multiple times, as many as 5 or 6 times on the battlefield, several with two or more loads in there. And the best that we can figure is that these guys were afraid and forgot that they, under the pressure of combat, forgot that they had loaded the weapon. And in a couple of cases, if they would have fired the weapon, it would have had most likely disastrous results for them. But this doesn't come out in a lot of these military histories of this. And it's unrealistic when it's admitted. So fear. Second of all, we have to take a look at smoke. This is an 1857 smoothbore musket at Fort McHenry, smoothbore cannon, 12-pounder Napoleon cannon at Fort McHenry. And this is going to fire a quarter charge. And I want you to look to the left of the cannon of how much this obscures. This is one cannon firing a quarter charge. Because you notice it's going to be reduced charge. There's no recoil in this gun when it fires. So they're getting ready to fire it. There it goes. There's the first smoke. So look at that to the left. You can't see anything, even on a quarter charge. Now, imagine on a battlefield where there are hundreds of artillery pieces firing, thousands of soldiers with muskets, especially on a battlefield with not a lot of wind. It's hot, humid day. The air is stagnant and smoke kind of hangs around. Sometimes you can hear the battle, you can't see it. And again, this is just continuing well after the piece had been fired. And something else I mentioned a little bit ago, that still 1/3 of the Army of the Potomac was equipped with smoothbore weapons. And this gentleman here, gentleman by the name of James Wolfe Ripley, he was in charge of U.S. Army Ordnance at the beginning of the American Civil War. He gets a lot of heat as to what actions he took at the beginning of the war. And I don't think a lot of people really appreciate the problems that he was facing. The pre-war American Army was 16,655 men, roughly. That's what American industry was capable of equipping properly. When the Civil War starts, he's now having armies of several 100,000. You know, he's going from 16,000 men to now he's got to equip 500,000 men, and he's got to equip them today, not with a weapon that might not be ready for another year or two. So let's take a look at Ripley. They had 35,355 rifle muskets on hand, 422,335 stocks of smoothbores, and rifled guns. Now, what it means by rifle, the rifle musket, they're talking about the 56 and 61 Springfields, the newer pieces. The 422, that's mostly smoothbores and flintlock smoothbores, even though some of them had been converted over to percussion cap. About 160,000 of those are in the South. So those are off limits. He's not going to be able to touch them. He's in the Union Army. And what he decided to do was that the rifle muskets would go to the regulars first. This is a reasonable decision. Most of the new guys coming in are not trained. Give the best equipment to the best trained soldiers. It's going to take time to get large-scale production of breech loaders. Think about, you know, when the PlayStations or Wii or whatever the new hot thing comes out, and when people sit in line at, you know, around the block of stores waiting to get in there to buy whatever the new hot topic at Christmas season or hot thing at Christmas season is, and they run out. That's in today's world. He's got to equip these soldiers with not only the weapons, the quartermaster has to equip them with uniforms and all types of equipment for soldiers and get them into the field. Does he have time when Mr. Spencer comes up to him and says, I've got this great rifle that's not been proven on the battlefield, and says, you know, and Ripley says, when can you get into production? Oh, I can start producing 200 or 300 in 6 months. Mr. Ripley said, or General Ripley says, I have to equip 500,000 now. What can you do for me now? And I'm not going to completely exonerate James Ripley, but he does need a little bit more understanding than I've seen in some of the History Channel or some of the documentaries about the Civil War. He's got to equip soldiers now. He can't wait for the hot Spencer weapon or the Henry weapon to come into large-scale production. And not to mention the fact that they've not been tested on the battlefield where the musket had been. It was a weapon he knew worked. Does the Spencer, does the Sharp work on the battlefield? That's open to interpretation at the time. So you have 3 phases of procurement for the Union Army. It's get any weapon into hands of soldiers through 1862. In 1863 and 1864, it's replaced obsolete arms with domestic production of rifle muskets. And then maybe in 64, 65, and this is kind of how it practically worked out, you can arm these soldiers with some of the newer weapons as they prove themselves on the battlefield, because they're also a lot more expensive. One of the things that's rarely talked about is most soldiers and most people in general cannot determine distance. And that's imperative when you are engaged in a marksmanship course, or if you're going to fire a musket with any semblance of accuracy. In the case of the 1861 rifle musket, when that was fired, if it was fired on the flattest ground possible and fired center man, and that means you're aiming center man at 300 yards, which is what its sights were capable of doing, the bullet would actually fly in a parabolic arc over the soldiers and hit them center man at 300 yards. So for the first 75 yards, that is a danger space or killing space. And then the next danger space is 110 yards right before 250 yards and ends sometime before 350 yards. And that's 110 yards at that area. It's 110 yards total of a danger space to the soldier. When you look at 150 or 200 yards, the bullet is literally flying over the heads of the soldiers. The question again, why do so many Civil War historians get this wrong? The problem is most of them are not military historians, meaning they don't understand the context of what the weapons are capable of doing, what the soldiers themselves are capable of doing with those weapons, nor are they military historians where they're familiar with what was going on in Europe, particularly Napoleonic Wars, or the Italian Wars of Independence, or the frequent wars in the Crimea, or the Crimean Wars, excuse me. They just aren't familiar with what was happening overseas. So they only study the Civil War and are therefore not historians of war itself, but just specifically the Civil War period. And that hurts them in this historical interpretation. So they have that lack of perspective. Brent Noseworthy in the book called The Bloody Crucible of Courage said this: do prominent Civil War historians also research and write about the Napoleonic era, the 18th century, or other wars of the 19th century? Almost none. But the rare men who do give us the greatest insight into Civil War combat. How can you understand Civil War tactics without perspective, without studying what Civil War generals studied, without comparing Civil War weapons to those that came before and after? You cannot. How can you understand Civil War tactics by looking solely at the infantry? Many Civil War historians attempt just that, getting bogged down in the minutiae of battles instead of gaining perspective by researching other eras. Because of this, many historians don't fully understand why Civil War combat was indecisive. And because of their lack of background, when historians specializing in the Civil War have seen Civil War generals write of Napoleonic tactics, firstly, they might not have understood what Napoleonic tactics were, something more than men fighting shoulder to shoulder. And secondly, it didn't occur to them that Napoleonic might refer to another Napoleon, Napoleon III. And that, again, is why so many Civil War historians still get this wrong today. With that, this concludes this video. I hope everyone enjoyed it, and I hope you have a good day.